Wie immer begrüße ich sehr gerne in deutscher Sprache alle Anwesenden im Namen des Instituts für Kunstgeschichte der TU, von unserem Institut. Ich freue mich sehr, 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 dass Sie heute da sind. In 2 Sekunden läuft alles auf Englisch, aber wir verteidigen ein bisschen die deutsche Sprache noch und ich gebe sofort das Wort an Li, die Kuratorin dieser Reihe, auf die wir alle hier sehr stolz sind, liebe Li. Und ich freue mich auch, dass Fuga MC heute da ist, der Mitbegründer dieser wieder aufgenommenen Reihe. Und daneben sitzt Merten Lagatz, der Erfinder der Reihe. Also wir haben die ganze Provenienz vor Augen. Und Li, du bist die Zukunft und die Zeitgenössin dieser Reihe. So.
Thank you, Benedict. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I am the curator of this series together with Praia Schwachenwald, who is not here tonight. She's in San Francisco for her fellowship. But as usual, she sent us a video to introduce you to tonight's topic. And yeah, as usual, let's look at it together.
Hello and welcome, everyone. I am Freya Schachenwald, and together with Dioli Huang, I'm curating this event series called Tuesdays Dislocation. As you can see, I'm not with you tonight, but I still wanted to use the opportunity to give you a bit of an introduction to tonight's theme, dislocated languages. The idea for this session actually comes from our colleague, Lea Karlsson, who is also a student assistant at our department. And with Lea, we had a very interesting discussion about, first we were talking about books that we've been reading recently, and somehow our discussion went into the direction of talking about languages and actually the role that languages play in colonial histories and the other way around, and also the continuities of this history of languages and colonialism. So how do we use words? How do we write? How do we express ourselves in which languages? One central concern that Lee and I have when we are organizing this event series is why are we organizing this event series in English? And of course it has advantages. We can include a more international community to come to our department, and we can have this exchange in across languages by using English, which in the end is one of the most taught languages in the world. But on the other hand, by making this conversation or making these conversations in English, we are also excluding people, those who haven't learned English and who haven't learned the words and expressions that that we are maybe familiar with as researchers working on colonial histories. And so this is a question that we haven't really answered, and we still stick with speaking English because we think it allows greater inclusion. But yet, why is it English? And of course that is turns back to questions of the role of British imperialism and how English as a language was spread throughout the world in this history. But the question of languages and colonialism is, of course, not only limited to British history, but we also have to look at the role of German in Germany's own colonial histories. And this includes both language policies, colonial language policies of the time, but also how language and German has been used to create a kind of colonial self. So this session today, the idea is to look at the tensions of colonialism in relationship to languages, to look at both moments of inclusion and exclusion, of empowerment, of ways to rethink language, but also at the more complex and complicated histories of the relationship between language and colonialism. I think I've said enough for now, because it is really up to our wonderful panelists to dive deeper into this topic, and I hope you will have a great evening and lively discussions.
That was Freya. And so also thank you from my side to Lea Carlson, our colleague who is sitting behind there, always behind the scenes, who gave us the idea and the inspiration to this session. Sometimes our conversation in the office leads nowhere, sometimes it's a KuK Tuesday session. And yeah, tonight I want to introduce to you our host, Dr. Michael Asikinga. Yes. Michael Asikinga is a postdoctoral researcher working on Cameroon's cultural heritage in Germany. In his dissertation, which he completed as a member of the Reverse History of Collections project funded by the German Research Foundation at Technische Universität Berlin, he looked at Cameroonian objects of power in German museums, meanings and significances from the violent colonial exploitation to post-colonial history. He showed how the German colonialists in Cameroon systematically translocated the symbols of traditional power before establishing their colonial authority and designating themselves as masters of the colony. Mika's research interests also include provenance research on human remains from the colonial context. One of his major contributions in this area is his active participation in the Sensible Provenances project of the University of Göttingen, where he researched the Cameroonian human remains in the anthropological collection. Working with colonial archives, Mika's research on human remains and cultural artifacts has brought him into contact with racist terms and colonial terminology developed over centuries and is still visible today in the database of German museums. And that's why he's the perfect host for tonight's session. And yeah, the floor is yours, Mikael.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. Thank you for Freya, the two curators of this session. Thank you also for the whole departments for having me as the moderator of this session. I have prepared 2 slides for opening the debate, but we have also wonderful guests tonight who will bring us deep into that debate. So I would like to start with my presentation. And the colonial terminology was introduced very early to serve and support the colonial enterprise. For example, major symbols of royal power in the colonies, such as thrones, are referred to in the archives as chairs or beds, thus devaluing and ignoring the importance or the power function of those very symbols. Furthermore, the chiefs owner of these thrones were treated as kinglets, as you can see on those slides. Kinglets is a kind of translation of this word, Häuptling. And when you see Häuptling, there is a series of other words you can build using the same term. And my position or the results of my research is that when you put those this word Häuptling in front of the term staff or throne, for instance, it automatically means in the colonial context that this throne or the scepter is of less value because it belongs to someone who the colonists did not consider important. And on the other side of the slide, you see a kind of terminology that Suzanne Arts and his colleague Nadja Ufwate-Alazar edited in a book in German, Wie Rassismus aus Wörter spricht, and they have classified how people refer to Western countries or Western cultures, and how people describe all the former colonial countries when they talk about chiefs, for instance, they used to say politicians, or sometimes it's society, or sometimes you just have people. On this other side, in the case of the former colonies, they keep talking about Häuptling, that is still the concept of kinglet, and then referring to the people, the inhabitants of those former colonies, they speak about ethnia, and that's something that we have been also discussing in the project Reverse History of Collection to deal with that colonial terminology, because it does not necessarily reflect how the culture of those people, and why do we refer to some religion as Natur Religion, for instance. So those are the different words. We have thousands of examples, but I wanted to emphasize all those you are seeing on the screen, and I've just used the database of the Berlin Ethnological Museum and the occurrence of all those words you see, because we have worked with the databases of 45 public museums in Germany. So if you want to have a kind of final amount, you come up with more than 10,000 racist and colonial terms that it's in the databases of the German museum institutions. So during the colonial time, the resistance of those chiefs called kinglets by the colonizers was reduced through the so-called punitive expedition, and their religious objects was qualified as fetish. It's somewhere on the table. And it came also to pass that world communities were just categorized as kirti. It means pagans, because they have refused to convert to Christianity, for instance. And those words like kirti is a pure refusal to recognize the beliefs of the inhabitants of Cameroon, for instance, and their philosophy. And the use of the colonial and racist language was thus extended not only to the politics, but also to religion, economy, and medicine. All the aspects of the social life in the former colonies were impacted with that colonial terminology. And I would like also to point out that those terms that they used to qualify sometimes as chair or hoka in the German language are very important objects. And the question will be, how can you ignore the importance of such a great object that is still visible in some German museums today? Not all thrones are so big like Manduyenu, but in most of the cases, you cannot ignore the importance of those symbols of power. And with that question, I would like now to introduce our guests and speakers who will bring us to discuss further all those questions. And I will just start by Gwendolyn Choi, who is a PhD student at the University of Oxford, where she takes as her focus representations of German colonialism in literary, material, and visual culture from the late 19th to early 20th century. She is particularly interested in how fantasies of coloniality during this period were used to construct and respond to notions of German nationality and race. More broadly, she enjoys exploring the fields of cognition, post-humanism, social epistemology, memory, and somatics. As a former logician and occasional translator, she also relishes any opportunities to revisit these practices. She will be discussing how literature and language in the imperial era were used to shape colonial fantasies for a domestic German audience, an example of banal nationalism and everyday coloniality. In turn, this colonial ideal was used to define a specific sense of Germanness as superior, white, culturally enlightened, and a naturally benevolent colonizing force. She thus hopes to demonstrate that colonial literature is a useful medium not only through which to understand German conceptions of the colonial, but also to understand Germanness. Some of her key themes include nationhood and national identity formation, the notion of Germanness, racist rhetoric, and the power and impact of literature. Welcome. Our second speaker is Dora Chen, a trilingual playwright and works and lives in Berlin, Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. Born and raised in Nanjing, China, she holds a bachelor degree in dramatic writing from Shanghai Theatre Academy and a master's degree in the visual language of performance from Wimbledon College of Art. Her Chinese plays have been read or performed in several cities in China. In 2021, the Junges National Theater Mannheim's production of Qingdao, a messy archive in which she worked as a dramaturge and writer, was nominated for Best Play by Nachkritik.de. A multilingual play, Epiphany, was shortlisted for the Strickmark at Theaters Treffen 2022 and will be staged in 2024. She will be talking about languages and silences. She explores the multi-language in her recent plays, Epiphany. You can also find online the synopsis of that drama. Maybe she will also share some links afterwards with the audience. Thank you and welcome. So we give you have now the floor to have an introductory talk, and then afterwards we will have the discussion among us first, and then open up the discussion with the public.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. As Mikael has kindly mentioned, my name is Gwendolyn, and I feel really honored to be here today to share a little snippet of my research with you. Today, I'll be giving a quick overview of the link between language, German national identity, and colonialism from a historical literary perspective, as we look today to see how language influences the way we think and act as communities. As we know, for many decades, the German colonial period has been understudied. This is despite the genocidal violence and exploitative occupation imposed upon Germany's former colonies. There were a variety of reasons for this so-called amnesia on the German side, which we might discuss later on, but this strikingly asymmetrical historiographical attitude has left Germany with studies of colonialism that ignore race, that don't see postcolonialism as applicable to Germany. This ignores the importance of German colonialism on German national identity today, and of course the ongoing impact of colonialism today. However, this is changing over the last 3 decades thanks to activists and scholars such as yourselves. Further engagement has been called upon for further engagement with Germany's colonial past. Progress is happening for a variety of reasons. The centenary of the Herero and Nama genocide in 2004, the opening up of archives after 1989, the independence of Namibia in 1990, and growing calls by the German public, such as yourselves, for increased pressure on the German government to engage with their colonial history on themes such as reparations, restitution of objects, and post-colonial debate. However, analysis of language and literature has still remained underrepresented, perhaps due to it being considered Trivialliteratur. I think this ignores how important language is in shaping ideas of community and ideas of public discourse. After all, novels and texts are the way that the public engages with themes and ideologies, including coloniality, because specialist texts were at the time only read by upper middle class stakeholders, such as businessmen who were interested in exports in the colonial republics. In response, I'd like to look at some texts today to stress the importance of imperial fantasies within the German fabric culture, and thus the importance of looking at colonialism within Germany today. I'll look at how literature and language shape the idea of the colonial for a German audience, and I say the word colonial here to imply that it was not specific to any actual colony, but in fact a fantasy, and then how those colonial fantasies, in turn, were used to shape a sense of Germanness, and of course to show how important literature and language were in doing so, that it wasn't simply top-down politics, but it was also in the children's stories and fairy tales that everyday people read. So I'm going to be borrowing some quotations from two texts. My first one is Frieda von Bülow's 1889 autobiographical travel diaries that she wrote when she traveled to Deutsch-Ostafrika in 1887, 2 years after it was colonized in 1885. Over on the right, we have Volk ohne Raum by Hans Grimm, and that is after the formal imperial period, and I wanted to include that to show that these colonial ideologies and the project of coloniality still went on after the end of formal empire. The decolonization of Germany did in no mean decolonization. So that's from 1926. So Frieda von Bülow was a noblewoman. She was the ex-lover of Karl Peters, who I'm sure you have all heard of, and she was a plantation owner. She went in 1887 to Deutsch-Ostafrika as a nurse, but quite frankly, she did not care about nursing, nor was she good at it. She mostly went to document her adventures. So the thing to bear in mind is that she needed to present a sanitized version of the colonies to her audience. At this point, notice the publication date, 1889, the German colonial empire was pretty new. The average person in Germany didn't know very much about the colonies and were wondering, why should I care? How is this going to affect my life? So she needed to present an authoritative but sanitized version of her life to show without violence what life could be like in a way that would convince people of its benefits. So one of the things that we need to bear in mind is how she interspersed racial language, racist language, and racial fears with so-called objective, mundane, boring descriptions of life. So over here, we've got examples of pejorative, generalizing, and dehumanizing language that coalesces the colonial into a mythic other. So we've got primitive and bestial language over here, and we can see that Frieda von Bülow is using language to situate indigenous people in some kind of fake ahistorical past, on some kind of teleological spectrum, from primitive and underdeveloped to enlightenment, with of course Germans sitting over here. The idea that Germany had achieved some level of moral, spiritual, and intellectual development that the indigenous folk could not reach because they were here in this biologically deterministic past. You can see how she's using scientific racism and other forms of social Darwinism to back up her theories. So what I'm interested in is to see how the language she's using, which dehumanizes indigenous folk, is used as some kind of Gegenstück, as a foil, to craft a sense of Deutschtum in opposition. The idea that you can encourage a sense of racial terror, as well as emphasizing the idea of a German Kulturvölker in comparison to the Naturvölker that you spoke about earlier, by contrast. So over here, you have description of singing. So these quotes are side by side from the same page. So you have this idea, you've got jackal, you've got wild dogs, compared to the kräftig und so melodisch singing of German sailors, so obviously civilized, quote, dass ich mich sofort sage, da marschieren Deutsche, end quote. This draws on contemporary ethnographic understandings of anthropological development, which said that you could arbitrate Volkscharakter from music. On the right-hand side here, we have two quotations from Volk ohne Raum, so this is 1926 now. So this is describing the idea of some kind of inherent, noble, hardworking nature, the idea that Germans are inherently honorable, right? Directly in comparison with this idea that this is exclusive to white Germans. This all leads to this idea here that you have a hierarchy of races. So what we can see here is that Germanness is being constructed via opposition. Remember that both authors are writing in a way to present themselves as factual and trustworthy. So these highly ideological claims, these propagandistic claims, aren't so obvious as they might otherwise be today. So you can see here in this first quote, so remember she was a nurse, right? So here she's describing one of her patients as being sick because of their living standards, because they were unorderly, because they were dirty. So what this essentially does is conveys to the reader that to be German is to be civilized, educated, clean, orderly, to keep your house in a certain way. So there's an element of racial sanitization, which also reflects actual historical practice. In Robbie Aitken's 2007 monograph, he talks about how children of mixed-race colonial settlers proved that they should be considered German citizens because they were clean and kept their house in a certain way. The idea of having a separate kitchen and bathroom from your living area, for example. So that's Exclusion and Inclusion from 2007. And over here, these two bottom quotes are from Volk ohne Raum. The idea that Germanness has solidified, right? Kerndeutsch, eingeboren Deutsch. The idea that your Blute makes you German, feinen Gesichter. So we see here that it's solidified into something völkisch, right? It's no longer just an idea of a Kulturnation, but an idea that there's something inherently German. The idea that it's blood, not soil. So we can see here that there are tactics to convince the audience that colonization is beneficial for Germany and for the colonies. But language doesn't just affect ideology, it shapes and makes your world. So here we have the idea that the land needs the hands of Germans. So this quotation, das Gebild von Menschenhand, that's from Theodor Fontane. So it's the idea that von Bülow now is saying that all the land needs is German people. We especially can introduce ideas of civilization. Germans are portrayed as essential to God's stewardship of the earth as Kulturträger. You are almost required to colonize. Hans Grimm also uses a similar tactic. He does something slightly different. He presents the land as empty. Where's the quote? Dieses große leere Land. This idea that the land is empty. Of course it was not empty, but these are the kind of rhetorical tactics he was using with language to convince the readers at home in domestic Germany that colonization was necessary. This, of course, preemptively anticipates the 1904 to 1907 genocide, which, of course, he knows about by the time he's writing this. So what does this show us? So far, we've looked at how racist ideas of colonial lands and colonialism are conveyed through very specific language to create a sense of Germanness by contrast. And then how that's used to further justify conquest, the idea that colonization is necessary and best for the land. By the end of the text, Germans are presented as natural conquerors. But how are these texts operating? There's a kind of reinscription of ideological views that inscribe and normalize racist language. The texts are almost creating the kind of audience that would want to read this. Note, Volk ohne Raum is 1,200 pages long, so if you actually finish the book, by the end I'm sure you were fairly convinced. So there's this idea that you are creating colonialism through colonialist rhetoric. There's a very clear link. And I think if you look at these quotes, you can see the authors were definitely aware of this. There was no way that they weren't aware of the link between literature, text, storytelling, and belief. These last three are from Volk ohne Raum, and the first one is from Frieden von Bülow. You can see that the idea of creating your own story to then believe and share with other people is highly necessary, and they definitely believed in the idea of a textually constructed I, the idea that aesthetic engagement can expand our imaginative reach. The idea that you can manipulate language to convey a sense of natural ownership and create a sense of a reader. So today I've suggested that both authors convey a sense of collective identity, a collective German identity, through colonialist rhetoric, through difference. This hinges on colonialism and, in turn, circularly begets further conquest. Literary analysis too, I suggest, gestures at how the metaphorical presence of the colonial is fundamental to the racialized myth of German exceptionalism. There is a power to literature. It transforms and transfigures, and can also propagate a sense of colonial imaginary for nationalist purposes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn. And I think that we have already gathered some questions in the audience. Just write down your questions. Afterwards, you have the possibility to ask them. You have spoken about the dramaturgy of Bülow, and maybe before I'm back to you, I would like you to start thinking about a bit the notion of writing and then representing. Was that colonial language something that was essentially written, or was it any necessity to combine it with representation, visual representation, as to, because you said that she was more worried about how to represent herself in the colony, and she wanted everything to be clean and so on and so forth. And the second aspect is that the notion of Germanness was constructed on the idea of whiteness. How do we, or can we approach this notion from our today's perspective, because there are people of color who are also German citizens? Is there anything you could say about it? And then is the notion of Germanness still very present even in everyday discourses in outside of Germany? So maybe you can start thinking about those two questions before we are back to you. Now we turn to our second speaker, who will be very interactive with the audience, so be aware of that. They can ask you to read something or say something. So that is how she prepared her presentation. Just be part of the presentation so that will help us a lot to move forward together. Have the floor.
Thank you so much. And may I have a small, thank you. Yes, I'm not going to talk, excuse me. I'm not from the academia branch, so please excuse me. I think today I'm going to share a bit about my own practices of writing in different languages, especially the working experience as a migrant language worker in Germany. So, as I think I have already in different occasions. So first of all, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the input from Gwendolyn. I feel inspired. I feel that there is a lot we still haven't talked properly within the German theater branch, like about languages, about how German language influenced the languages in its previous colonial countries or areas, and how how we reflect on the languages that we like, the effect, like the relationship between the language that German used to impose in the other countries, and the re-effect, like something goes back to the German culture. I think within theater branch, as far as I know, I think there is very few discussion about that. So what I can present today is just a few working experience and a few working samples from myself. As I obviously come from China, so in our culture, I think languages, of course, Mandarin, Chinese, Han language plays an important role. But also, I guess from my personal experience, I feel that also in the Eastern Asia culture, I feel that silences also play a very important role in communication, other than what we observe in German. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about silences in the end, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to be silent. So it's alright. So basically, I would like to talk a bit about one of my recent plays called Epiphany Wu. Actually, this is a play. This is a play based. Thank you very much from the introduction from Mikael. I think it's very interesting that I took part in this Mannheim National Theatre project, which was a very inspiring project. Actually, me, the in-house dramaturge and director, we curated a research trip back to China. To Qingdao. I don't know anyone know anything about Qingdao. Qingdao used to be a German colony around the end of 19th century and the very beginning of 20th century. So basically from 1897 to 1940, around 1940. So Qingdao was German colony for a short time. So we actually in 2019 we actually planned this research trip back to Qingdao with a team of almost, I think, how many of us? Eight peasants altogether. So we were performers, we were directors, writers, dramaturge, stage designer, music designer, so a group. And then we went back to Qingdao. It was a very interesting research trip. We actually learned, I don't know if you know about, in China, we've got this technique, is shadow play. We learned that in Qingdao, we actually participate in the local theater scenes, and we discussed we visited all the locations which were previously German. The governor house or the hotel from the German colonial time, and they learned a little bit Chinese and. And yes, we spent about 10 days in Qingdao, and that was a very interesting trip for me because I am a Chinese until now. I'm still a Chinese citizen, but the first time I had the experience to talk about colonialism is actually when I worked as part of the team in Germany, because in China actually we don't have the experience of talking about colonial. very often in our history lessons or in our theater, so to say. So it was a very unique experience for me. And then I think it was very interesting at that point is that one of our colleague, a German colleague who shared Eastern European heritage, asked me a question seriously. She said, "Why don't you Chinese hate German?" Because everywhere we met person, he said, "Wow, Germany used to own our city, and look at this house, it's beautiful." And I think it's a huge problem in decolonization all around the world, even for some cities who used to be the colony of the other European countries, tend to avoid talking about history and avoid identity. I think there's a huge room or huge ambiguity that we need to discover when we talk about like decolonialism or decolonialization or post-colonialism. And this is the, do I have to read it again? Maybe everybody has already read it through. So this is a play that after I worked in National Theatre Mannheim, we did this great online show, Qingdao, a messy archive. I can share with you. There is actually a website. So because it was developed in Corona time, so we didn't really have time to present it on stage. We prepared a lot, but it stopped unfortunately by the Corona. And then we turned it into an online form, and it's a website. It's called an archive. So you can take some time to browse into the information. It contains our research trip, also contains the necessary information of Qingdao and German colony in China, and also contains a short play from me and contains the music piece from my colleagues. So it's a funny website, but I think in the end, because of the Corona situation, and also I think because of this unique experience, I decided during Corona time, I was invited by Bauhaus Neue Straße to write a play. So I decided to write a semi-autobiographical play about this theater piece. So this is Epiphany Duohu is actually a play based on my private experience when I was working in Mannheim Theater. But of course, it's a drama, so there is something that I try to manipulate as an author. So this is synopsis of Epiphany. A 30-year-old Chinese woman, or characters here without names, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G. A lives in Beijing and Berlin and earns a living as an interpreter. She really wanted to work in German theater, but was denied. The opportunity shouldn't be there. Was denied because of the cultural gap between China and Germany. The 30-year-old German B invites her to join a theater project about post-colonialism. The two came to Qingdao, a former German colony in China, in 1900, but each begins his or her own journey to expand the boundaries of his or her life. But it's a journey without a destination. So this semi-autobiographical monologue written by me is not in 3 languages actually. Actually, it's the main language is 3, German, English, and Chinese. But it also contains a little bit Russian and a little bit French. So the play is a reflection on the history and post-colonial situation of Germany and China, which comes from the inner reality of an individual, because it's the unique part of the play is that there is this main character A always have this inner monologue besides the main storyline. So and at the same time, which comes from and at the same time, an absurd road comedy about identity, political correctness in Germany. It's an ironic, surprising, and tender play. Yes. So now I'm going to ask if there anyone would like to read a selection of this part. We have I have three characters, A, B, and M. Is there anyone speak Russian? Great. Then this is.
You can help us. You can just.
You can help me with M, but it's the second part, so we have time here. Anyone would like to read to help me?
Which language? English, German, French?
I guess you can be A if you like. There is some part of Chinese, but I can add up to it.
I don't read Chinese.
No, but I can, there are only few words. No, I think for A there are very few words. Let's try this.
Okay.
And anyone would like to be B? 30-year-old German?
It's German, right?
Yes.
The B person is German.
Yes.
Okay.
But you are A.
Yeah, I'm A. Yeah. Or like to be the B person.
Yes.
Living in German.
No, I think it contains different languages, English and German.
Okay.
Who's on to me? 30-year-old German?
Maybe it excludes people, but let's just say German.
Yes. No, you don't have to be 30-year-old.
Yeah.
Would you like to read? Yes. Thank you so much.
So, how do we organize the exercise? I am A,
Would you like to sit here?
Martin is B, and our colleague is M, or?
Yes. Would you like to sit here? Please. So the first part, there are two different things. One thing happens in a temple in Qingdao, the other thing happens in a theater in Mannheim. So the first part will be played by A and B and B, and the second part will be A and M. Okay.
Okay.
We don't have enough microphones, so
Could you all speak into the microphone for the recording?
Yeah. So, B begins.
All the gods and goddesses wear a set of traditional Chinese clothes.
Yes.
Their postures are very similar, and their features of face are more or less alike for me.
Not really for me.
There is no detailed information in any other languages than Chinese in the temple.
No, you are right.
Don't you think this is interesting?
How interesting.
Ever since the ancient time, the gods and goddesses from the other cultures were included and integrated by the Chinese culture. However, none of the processes was recorded, reflected, and clarified with the original cultures of the immigrated figures. For me, it's clearly a message of collectivism.
Why?
For not all people want their gods to be imprisoned in someone else's temple. The gods of some peoples would like to live in a small separate pavilion. The gods of some peoples want to live in a hole underground. The gods of some peoples are invisible. The gods of some peoples are attached to a shaman.
For me, the Chinese culture translates and transplants the figure and stories in other cultures into itself, like a huge melting pot with all the ingredients. You could make your own decision and choose whatever you like in it.
But who are you?
Who am I?
Do you still consider yourself as a Chinese?
Now we are not talking about intercultural communication. We are approaching the difference between Asian and European ideologies.
If you say so.
Regarding to this, we must not only play with certain words like collectivism or individualism, but also pay attention to the differentiation of the single case of them between cultures.
What does individualism mean in China?
When you talk about individualism, you mean you walk out of the closet with your family and your friends, so you gain your personal sexual freedom, right?
Absolutely.
May I ask, will you share with the public the true experience of communicating with your parents?
Of course I would.
Not as an artist, but as a local man from Rostock.
Why not?
Excuse me, do your family really accept your sexual preference?
Yes, of course.
As you can sense in the temple, in traditional Chinese culture, people were quite open with sexual preferences.
I highly doubt that.
This is what I mean. That's the cultural differences. The Chinese and the Germans have completely different mindsets. If we continue to discuss the term in the language that we are applying now, I will say what the individualism is highly connects the question, what are the basic rights of human being? The oriented question is, what is human being? In Chinese culture, we think we human beings, as well as the society established by human beings, are part of the nature. It means that we are not smarter or more prestige than the best parts of the nature. And it's possible that our society is less developed than the societies 5,000 years before or after. The core of our culture is circulation, not the fulfillment of the individuality.
How can there be social inclusion without the freedom of each individual?
It depends on how important you think the existence of humans is to the nature of the universe.
And now we're switching scenes.
Yeah, now scenes 2. Yeah, now is M und A auf Deutsch.
Kommen Sie aus China?
Ja,
Ich komme aus Russland.
ach, wie sagt man Hallo auf Russisch?
Привет. Я в порядке.
Ja,
Mir geht es gut.
sorry, ich bin verwirrt. Können Sie das noch einmal wiederholen?
Я в порядке.
Ja, Privaryatska.
Ja, ja.
Jetzt Chinese.
你会说中文吗？一点点。
Ich habe nur ein paar Stichwörter auf Chinesisch gelernt.
Wo? In der Sprachschule?
Nein, mein Sohn studiert in China. Letztes Jahr habe ich ihn besucht und Straßenchinesisch gelernt.
Sehr schön. Ach so, es gibt viele chinesische Schriftzeichen in dieser Ausstellung. Sie können durch chinesische und deutsche Übersetzungen lernen. Zum Beispiel, China wird so auf Chinesisch geschrieben.
中国。
Schauen Sie sich dieses Zeichen an.
中。
Ist von der Mitte abgeschnitten und es bedeutet die Mitte. Der Teil in der Mitte von
国。
lautet,
玉。
bedeutet Jadesiegel, ein Symbol für alte chinesische Könige.
国。
Repräsentiert einen Ort, der das Jadesiegel umrahmt, und dieser Ort stellt die Grenze eines Landes dar. Die Jade und die Rahmen machen ein Land, ganz genau.
Wieso nennen Sie
中国
mittleres Land?
Vor langer Zeit hieß China nicht,
中国
sondern
中华
ist eine Kombination aus
中
und
华
es bedeutet in der Mitte und wunderschön. Damals wussten die Chinesen sehr wenig über den Rest der Welt und der Rest der Welt wusste sehr wenig über China. Die Chinesen waren sehr stolz auf ihre Kultur. Sie hielten sich für das Zentrum und das schönste Land der Welt.
Interessant.
Sicher.
Aber das war vor langer Zeit.
das war's
Das war's.
I think I have only a few pages about silences. It's I think it's very interesting that this piece actually in Epiphany Do, this is a piece contains, it's like a road trip, so it contains lots of locations and things from different countries and cultures. And then it was read in Germany and in where is it? In Denmark, and also in China. I directed one like play reading in China with the support from Goethe Institute. So it was very interesting because every time when I try to present the reading of the play, I actually need to adapt to the situation of the countries. It was a rare experience for the authors, for the playwrights, because usually playwright wrote everything and it's fixed there, and translation will be the translation will be done by the other people, like translators. But in this case, when this is my first multilingual play, I found it has got its liveness and it's how do you say Nachhaltigkeit, ecological side of this play, because every time when I present in a certain society or in certain culture, I have to rethink about the things in the play and try to see which part I should translate, which language I should adapt to. And it's very interesting. It's very, very interesting experience for me. And then last time I participated, when I talk about the multilingual play, actually I participated one panel in Drama Panorama in Berlin. So they invited me as part of the multilingual session. So actually I think there were several panelists, several like leaders in the workshops, and then I think in the end some scholar, I think one colleague from me actually said something which was very inspirational and very moving for me. He said that he noticed that through the workshop, through the panel, he noticed that our word is not a monolingual word, but a multilingual word, which is very important because monolingual society is an illusional utopia. I think it's a very, very interesting comment for me. And then, of course, I think for me, there is the other thing that I usually deal with when I write. Actually, when I write, I deal with lots of. I write in Chinese. Also, when I wrote in Chinese, I dealt with the theme of silence. Maybe I think it's maybe because I'm coming from Eastern Asia culture, and in our culture, silence is really important part of our language system. I think if anyone speak Chinese or Mandarin or yes, so because I think Han, the written language Han, and the spoken language Mandarin is basically a very flexible language. So it doesn't contain so much grammar. It's really context-based language. So in our language, it's very important to observe someone who I communicate with on time. There are a lot of things that is unsaid or invisible or hidden in the tone and in the pauses, in the silences from the people around you. So it's very because here I when I talk about silences, I think I am kind of being judged by not engaging in the debates, not engaging in the debates are operated by languages, but I also would like to share a bit about my mother tongue, the silences in my mother tongue, because when I wrote in Chinese, I actually write the silence of female intellect in China, the silence of a female body in a hospital, and the silence of homosexual son in the family, and the silence of IT programmer in metropolitan in China. So I wrote lots of monologues and inner monologues from those characters. It's because I also believe that a better universe in a world is in a world that people from different cultures and backgrounds could share one moment of the true silence. So it's not a silence that fight against something else, it's a resistant silence, but a silence that's deeply from our body and our soul, and which could be shared by all human beings at some moment randomly. That's what I believe. And that goes back to a concept of KuK. So KuK is a, well, if it translates into English, it's a very negative concept. It's like emptiness, voidness, nothingness, something like that. But actually, KuK, I think in Buddhism, it means something else. It means that everything is in transformation everywhere, every millisecond, and one must put his or her ego aside and carry on living. So KuK is something deal with your ego. So something like that. So ego in Chinese. The other day I talked with one of my Chinese friend. I said, how do I translate ego? And we found actually something similar in Buddhism, which is 我执, which means me stubborn. So stubborn me, something like that. So I think like towards the end of my presentation, so I would like to mention a bit about the silences in my own culture, and I do firmly believe that we human beings have shared some kind of languages, but that is now still hidden in the unseen silences that we haven't experienced so often. That's all.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. And then we have also played roles in your play that is interesting, and it's also astonishing to see that the remembrance about the Chinese colonial period in China is so good. It's exactly the same in the former African colonies. How did those Germans do it? That's the first question that comes into my mind. How did they manage to transform that question of the colonial legacy into something positive in the minds of the, I don't know, I think that is something we need to discuss, because people are keep talking about the positive aspects of colonization, and then the way they remember the German period is always good compared to the French period or English period, where,
In your country as well?
yeah, of course. That's why I never knew that even in Asia it's the same thing. So maybe worldwide, wherever the Germans have been and then they left, suddenly after their presence, you have a kind of things that transform everything there. Cultural remembrance. So yeah, we'll be back to that, but I wanted really to say that it is also the same thing in Namibia, in Tanzania. Many communities in Cameroon would not say that the Germans were bad to us, but they would rather say, yeah, compared to the Frenchmen, it was better for us to have the German colonization. Something like that. So yeah, I never knew that even in China it played the same role, or still the same remembrance. Yeah, great. I had 2 questions for you. Do you remember? Okay, that is good. I would like us to start with the question of the representation and the written language, especially the case of Bülow.
So, Frieda von Bülow was Germany's most successful colonialist women's writer. She was most famous for her fiction, actually. She wrote novels like Tropenkeller. The thing to note about her is that she was Adelsgeschlecht, so she was a noblewoman, but she wasn't particularly rich, because she's at this stage now where the nobility are declining and she needed to make money. So she decided that she would write a lot of Backfischromane, a lot of pretty not great novels, that would talk about tropes such as, fear of rape, fear of racial mixing, things like this. So they were often very violent. So in those fiction novels, there was definitely a lot of visual imagery, there were illustrations, there was a cover, and she was relying very much on sort of grotesque, racist illustrations and depictions in magazines such as Kladderadatsch or Simplicissimus, or other sorts of satirical magazines on both the far right and the far left and everywhere in between. So in terms of other forms of visual imagery she was relying on, at the time during the colonial empire and a little bit after, you also have Völkerschauen, the idea of the human zoo, right? So there were these big exhibitions, particularly the 1896, Berlin in Treptower Park, the big exhibition where they imported over 100 people from the various colonies, as well as materials to build model villages and so on. And then they were there for the whole duration of the Ausstellung, and they performed coloniality for the domestic German audience. And because entry to this was very cheap, this was the main way in which sort of working class Germans were able to interact with fantasies and conceptions of coloniality. So these were the sorts of visual images that were floating around at the time. There were postcards around this, there were a lot of advertisements in the newspapers. These were the sorts of things. And then right after the end of the war, you have Notgeld, so hyperinflation. Each town got to paint their own Notgeld, and there were lots of pictures of palm trees, bananas, chocolate, images of settler houses where colonial settlers used to govern from, things like that. So this is all the visual imagery that's being used. On your second question about whiteness, that's a very live question. So the idea that whiteness is sort of perceived as this exclusive category, you have to be German and white. This idea of this exclusiveness is precisely the research that's happening with Tina M. Kampt. She's at Princeton, she's a professor at Princeton. She did oral research. She interviewed a number of Afrodeutsche, and she asked, as born and raised Afrodeutsche, do you feel like you are German? Do you still feel excluded although you are born and raised? And she analyzed all of their interviews, and the summary of the research was pretty much, yes, they still felt deep down a sense of exclusion. And this work is by no means unfortunately surprising, because debates about what the German Nation entailed went back as far as the 18th century and earlier. There were sort of 3 main ideas: the idea of a Völkisch Nation, the idea of a Kulturnation, and the idea of a Staatsnation. So in this camp, you have this idea of a Großnation. It's blood, not soil. It's the idea that Austrian people in the Austrian Empire who spoke German should also be included in this idea of this big community of German-speaking people who are all sort of ethnically German and white. In the middle, you have a sort of in-between idea, the idea that it's about behavior, culture, language, Kulturnation was also advocated by a number of right-wing Jewish academics, such as Ernst Lissauer, who needed to somehow include himself in conceptions of Germanness that wouldn't exclude Jewishness at the time, in a period of rising anti-Semitism. And then you have Staatsnation, the idea that, yeah, Germany is just pretty much the borders of the political entity. So this was a live debate that was happening hundreds of years, and unfortunately, research today seems to support the idea that a lot of people still feel very excluded and discriminated against. And just on the last thing that you two were talking about, the idea that there is somehow this positive memory of German colonialism, that was precisely the German project in the 1920s. Treaty of Versailles happens, and the British government publishes something called the Blue Book. They basically go to Namibia, they interview a bunch of survivors of the genocide, and they say, hello, what did they do to you? Of course, this is not necessarily a trustworthy resource, as of course it's filtered through the eyes of British interviewers who want to portray Germany in a specific light. At the same time, it is one of our few surviving archival resources of what the genocide looked like. And Germans were very, very, very mad when this came out. They called this the colonial Schuldlüge, the idea that this was all a lie. So after the end of the war, they actually published something called the White Book in response, where they talked about how great they were. They were like, we were such a benevolent empire. We are so much better than all the others. So even in 1920, 1921, they were already embarking on ideological projects to promote themselves precisely as positive. So there's this idea that they're the best Kulturträger of them all. The idea that German exceptionalism was alive and well. So before they colonized, they were still the best language, best intellect. You know, they were the ones who reached enlightenment. The idea that Adorno still felt that he could only communicate in German. Beethoven was universal music, not German music, but universal because it was so good. The idea that German exceptionalism meant that they were the best colonizers, particularly in comparison. In the case of Tsingtao, a lot of interviewers realized that because of the memory of the Japanese colonization, that was the idea that Germans were better because they brought in the railways and they weren't as bad as the Japanese, so they must be great then. But there was a lot of ambivalence as well because a lot of people at the time felt that it was so barbaric to go and colonize someone that it actually reflected really badly on Germany. They said, you know, you are the barbarians, not us, because of course in Germany the rhetoric around the Eight-Nation Alliance and the Boxer Rebellion was that they're barbarians. So that goes to some of the sort of lies that promoted this idea of German benevolence. And this is in part what led to the colonial amnesia after the end of the war. The idea, well, we were only a colonial power for 30 years, we were pretty good, we weren't so bad, Belgium's the bad guy, just leave us alone and we didn't do anything. So that's a lot of the sort of rhetoric around that.
Yeah, thank you. Would you like to add something or more details about the idea of the positive remembrance?
Yes, I think from what I knew, because I'm not a scholar in this category, but from what I knew, actually, I totally agree with Gwendolina. Just that I think it's the positive memory or the positive comment on the German colonial time in Qingdao, I think is based on the later experience in comparison with the Japanese colony time. I think it's very important for the European to know what happened in China, in the last years of imperial Chinese, like Qing dynasty, at the end of 19th century and early 20th century. What happened to China is lots of European troops invaded China, and the most famous incident, because at that time when we try to find the local diaries, I already talked with you guys about this information, but it's like we try to find the diaries from the local Qingdao during the German colonial time, at around early 20th century. It was really hard for us because at that time Qingdao used to be a very small village, so it used to be a very remote area before German landed landed on Qingdao and turned it into one of, let's say, we have this like German had this name for Qingdao, which is the model colony. So it's at that time they would like to build Qingdao as one of the model colony for German, and they actually when they made the plan, like made a whole city plan of Qingdao. Actually, everything was planned here in Berlin. So the real way of how they build up the city, the municipal city map, the plan, everything was planned here in Germany. And when we visited the museum and the Maya's house, actually all the interiors, like you see those iron bars of staircase, they were all imported from Germany. So I think at that time, like German had this ambition to build up something like a beautiful Hafenstadt, a beautiful like a seaside city for German citizens in China, or so to say in Far East, something like that. But the thing is that there is this, because at that time like we didn't have we had a look at, I don't know if you know Mo Yan. Like Mo Yan won one of the Nobel Literature, who is also a Chinese author, and who was born in Shandong province, which is like Qingdao belongs to Shandong province right now. So he actually wrote a novel called 檀香刑, which is something based on the story from his hometown, and which included the stories in the colonial time. So it was when we looked into the material, it's very interesting that I noticed it's very hard to explain to my German colleague that Chinese people don't usually document daily life in diary. Of course, we write diaries. We write diaries, but the language is quite different. Like I said, the Mandarin, so to say, Han language, it has its flexibility. So for me, when I was young, when I write diary, I never write what I eat today, what did I do today. I always write what I feel today, what is the sensation today. So it's the way of traditional Chinese writing. Like we document different, in a different way. I guess there is a lot of explanation about why we apply language in this way. Maybe it's because thousands of years of bureaucracy, censorship, language censorship, because language censorship in China has a long history, very long history. So I guess it's, sorry.
This point is important. I wanted to say, because you mentioned in your presentation that people in China do not talk so much about the colonial past, and you have decided to write. Why is it important for you to write about this colonial past if it's not so much discussed? And yeah, that is something I am.
You mean me as a writer?
Yeah, you as a writer, and then the collective responsibility of talking about the Chinese colonial past. How do you deal with that if the majority in China is not eager to speak about that past?
Actually, I think it's because we had this project. We had this theater project. If I haven't had a chance to work with the team in German theater, probably I won't start with the colonialism, this theme. So to be honest, I think this is a random choice at the very beginning. But then when I worked as dramaturge in the theater project, I actually looked into, like I said, we tried to find the diaries of people at that time, but we can't. Actually, I looked into some of the novels, because at that time Qingdao, like around early 20th century, Qingdao was not only the colony of German and later Japanese, but also because there was a group of revolutionists in China, because at that time that was the transition of Chinese from the imperial China, like Qing dynasty, to the diplomatic China. So there had been this transition in Chinese society. So there were a group of revolutionists, scholars, intellects, and all those kind of people with new thoughts and new ideas were gathered in the colony, like in Hong Kong and of course in Qingdao as well. So there were lots of books from them, and lots of books which were written in Qingdao at that time. But the thing is that I found something interesting, because we actually haven't got any diaries. We tried really hard, but we haven't found any diaries. But we found a diary in, I don't know, any of you knew that there is a gathered, like from 8 European countries, there is a alliance, so to say, alliance of troops from 8 European countries invaded Beijing for about 100 days and occupied Beijing at that time. So that time, Beijing have been like intersectionized into different parts. Like, for example, French take one part, and German take one part, and Britain took the other parts, or took the other part, and it was like occupied. They were like Beijing was divided into different zones at that time. So fortunately, we found someone who's living in the German occupied zone at that time. It was a very interesting material. So but of course it's in Chinese. So I translate all those materials in a very simple language into German. And I think it helps me a lot to understand what I have like emotionally experienced, but never understand why I've got such kind of feeling, something like that. So another example for language, maybe I'll pass this to Gwendolina through this. Something which connects to what I just said is that ever since People's Republic of China was founded, Chinese, the language, Mandarin, and especially Han language, the written language, has been like drastically simplified. There were two main reasons. Of course, one reason was that there were lots of uneducated people at that time, and the complicated Chinese, which is used right now by people in Taiwan. So it's very hard to learn. It was very hard to learn. So they vote. I think there were language committee in China voted, and they decided to simplify the language. But then I have been questioned quite often that how Chinese people type with computer, because obviously we have a different character. So by answering these questions, I would like to say that there's still like let's say English central, that's a European centralism, but English centralism word, because all the Chinese people or kids, they have to learn this kind of pinyin system, which based on alphabet system. We have to type according to the pronunciation of one word, and then choose from a list of words, and then try to establish the whole sentences. For me, I think it's also a signal that with this dual language system that Chinese people currently nowadays have to adapt with. I think there is still kind of the Euro, so to say, English centralism in languages. Maybe after this, pass to Guanalina.
Yeah, thank you. I will have one more question, but we turn first to Guanalina because you mentioned something in the answer of the previous question that they imported so many people from the former colonies and then they perform coloniality. What do you mean by performing coloniality?
So if you're interested in reading a fictitious account of the Ausstellung, Hotel Buchholz by Julia Stinder is the name of the novel. Basically what happened is there was a big fair. It was the whole of Treptower Park, and you know how big that is, right? And they had a small section right by the river called Spree Afrika, and it was right on the margins. And of course, already the spatiality of that is telling you something, because right in the center was sort of a display of Wilhelmine and Bismarckian sort of military importance. They built this whole ship there, like, wow, we're so powerful, isn't everything great? Then on the margins, they had Spree Afrika, and they had the Cairo exhibition. And in Spree Afrika, they had, I think it was 109 people from the different colonies that they had taken from Papua New Guinea, from Togo, from Cameroon. They had tricked most of these people into coming. They had lied and said, oh, if you come here, you can receive an education. A lot of these people are actually highly educated. They were sons of important people, daughters of important people. And they were coming as some kind of, essentially, like diplomatic exchange. Of course, that was a lie, right? And they came and they were told to dress in supposedly authentic clothing, to build supposedly authentic houses. First of all, these people did not wear those clothing to begin with. This was like a German fantasy of what it looked like to live in these colonies, right? Then they had imported all this timber and all of these materials and said, why didn't you build these houses? These people had never built a house before, you know? They weren't construction workers. Yet they had to, and they were forced to. Unfortunately, I believe 4 people died due to the inhumane conditions because they slept sort of outdoors with like no heating, no sort of covers. And they were told every day when the visitors came, like a zoo exhibit, Völkerschauen, they had to perform. They had to do activities that were supposedly authentic. So you would have to, for example, spend your time cooking or spend your time cleaning the whole day. First of all, not only was that simply not true, it's also one of the most incredibly dehumanizing things to do. You're performing somebody else's image of your own self, right? So I'm drawn again to Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, where he said, the white man has woven me out of 1,000 details, right? The idea that you are somebody that has been, you know, projected onto yourself. So that's what I meant about performing coloniality. It's a really interesting exhibition. Unfortunately, I don't have my laptop with me right now, but if you're interested, I can send you images. Unfortunately, they're quite triggering and stressful images of the park and of what was going on. They had also built a fake fortress of what it would look like if you were so-called attacked by a so-called tribal chief. And, you know, there were people throwing spears in this fake fortress, in this sort of enclosed compound. And sadly, we don't know very much about these people because records were not taken. So there was actually an exhibition, I believe it was in 2017 in Berlin, that looked at trying to sort of find these people's names, you know, their age, what they did. But unfortunately, as much research as there has been, I'm not sure if they were able to get all 107 because, you know, there were simply no records taken because they didn't consider them human. And on what you were saying about multilingualism, coincidentally, the idea of being monolingual is actually a German concept that was created in the 18th century. You may be familiar with philosophers such as Schleiermacher and Herder, and they were very interested in this idea of this monolingual language. First of all, they needed to prove that Germany was great. Germany was the best. The German language, because we're in Enlightenment times now, the Aufklärung, they were specifically trying to prove that the German language gave you special access to enlightenment, special access to a certain level of knowledge. And secondly, they needed to unify, and the idea of a monolingual society was very useful to them. But even in Europe, or any other continent in the world, the idea that you only spoke one language was not your reality. Because people didn't move a lot, you had dialects and languages that were very local. If you think about accents to this day, we've all sort of merged into one, but even 30, 40, 50 years ago, there were far more dialects, accents, and languages spoken in a small area. So in fact, we were a multilingual society for the better part of a millennia. And it's only been in the last 100, 200 years that we've had this idea of monolingualism, the idea that language is connected to the political nation state, the idea of a Kulturnation, the idea of political belonging being linked to your language. If you think about how language has always changed, always evolved, but for various political purposes, governments are really keen to guard their borders because of border anxieties, ethnic anxieties, racial anxieties, by governing language, disciplining your use of language for good and bad reasons. And a lot of scholars today think that we're actually living in a post-monolingual society and we've returned back to our multilingual roots.
Yeah, maybe just to add something on that, they talk a lot about diversity in Germany today, even in the literature. Do you think it's a complete switch, even if some people think we are in a post-monolingual society? Is that a complete switch position itself against what was considered as to be the German nation or maybe the Germans?
I think although it could seem like the writers of today are making a big departure from before, that would be remiss of me to ignore the many, many years of work that authors and activists have done for the last 100 years to make this transition. So if you think nowadays who's winning literary prizes, who's well known, you have Mitu Sanyal, Identity, Sharon Dodwa Otsu, you have Yoko Tabara, you have Mutazunga, the novel. So you've got lots of examples of famous, well-read writers. You may have read and studied these people, you may have met these people. But it would be wrong of me to just assume, they came out of nowhere. Of course, they came from a legacy of people who were not noticed. But if we even think about sort of intra-colonial politics in Europe, this year is the centenary of Kafka's death. And Kafka has obviously been received as sort of a classic German writer. You probably studied Kafka in schools, the idea that Kafka is this quintessential German writer. But of course, Kafka in many ways might not have seen himself as pure German, right? And Kafka spoke multiple languages and is still considered to this day as also a Czech icon. So you've got all these borders, you've got the Sudetenland, you have Poland and Germany, you have Czechia and Germany. You have a long history of classic German writers actually writing from places of multilingualism, such as Kafka. Hermann Hesse also is more global than we think. There's a lot of studies nowadays sort of referencing the global reach of these authors. For example, Kafka is actually a big hit in Korea. So we have not only the global reception of classic German texts, but it would also be good for us to sort of look at how classic German texts were written by multilingual authors who saw themselves as fundamentally multilingual and saw themselves as German and something, that German could be both two things at once.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we have also triggered some questions in the audience, so maybe before opening up the discussion with the audience, I had one more question about the concept of silence, because you gave so many details about silence or silences, as you call them. How those silences impact the communication between people from different cultures, maybe still living in China, because you have decided to write in many languages. In the same play, you use Chinese, you use German, you use English, you use some other languages. Okay, and is that something? I don't know how to put it in contact with the notion of silences, but all those communication, how to silence play a role in what we are living today in a multilingual society. and cultural, multicultural society.
Wow. Thank you so
That
much.
if silences
for the
have completely
big
disappeared from
question.
China, you can also say that was
Yes.
a way of communicating that does not exist, something like that.
Silence for me, I think silence for me means not only about not talking, but also about the other elements that play roles when we are talking. So I guess I just came back from Tehran 2 days before, and I don't speak Farsi. I can speak only very few words of Farsi in order to order or say hi, but I don't speak the language. I guess we all have the experience that we, as a traveler or visitor to a country, that we seldom speak any of the languages. So in this situation, sometimes I feel that I do connect to, I try to distinguish if the disappearance of a language or the disappearance of certain level of communication allows me to get closer with the local people when I am a traveler or visitor. I try to distinguish if this is a misunderstanding or this is some misinterpretation from my side, or there is something that deeply connects us as human beings. I do when I migrate to Germany, I speak no German. I learned German from the streets and the Volkshochschule. I never attend any German university. So I guess for me, from this experience, I have several stages of languages. First of all, I can't speak any German, so all German languages for me is a piece of music. So when I walk on the street, I feel like I am immersed in a huge pour of musical elements or something like that. But then when I knew a little bit German, but not enough German to understand everything, I feel like there is these sentences, like a word, there is some words like flying through me, but I don't get it. There is some kind of distances between me and the language and German. And then now my German is getting better. So sometimes I feel that when I came back from Iran, finally landed in Berlin, and I start to speak German, I feel like I am attached to something that is somehow very much like home to me. So I feel like there is this kind of curve when you learn new languages, right? So I feel, but I do understand one thing when I visit the other countries or cultures that I don't understand the language at all. I do notice that language is not the most important part that makes people communicating with each other or not. I think the wish to communicate and the wish to share something is more important than the ability of language itself. That's my own, from my personal experience.
Yeah,
so.
that is something formulated in a very nice way. Thank you. We open now the discussion with the audience, and feel free to ask your questions directed to Gwendoline, directed to Doha, directed to me, directed to someone who is maybe an expert also in the audience who could add more details about the topic of today, dislocated languages.
I just wanted to invite you to the next session of KuK Tuesdays, which takes place on the 28th of May. And this on a topic which is, very, very interesting. It's called Tasting Decoloniality. We will talk about food and the idea of the dislocation or translocation of ingredients over time. And I'm very excited to announce 2 confirmed speakers, and we asked a third person, but we don't know if this person has time. So 2 confirmed speakers are Felon Tiffany Cabral, who is a researcher and editor of the book Biting Back, Essen, Widerstand und Diaspora, and the artist and filmmaker and curator Monsisu Satrawa, who deals with different ingredients in her artistical practice. And this panel will be hosted by our dear colleague Pega Birnband, who's here at the Institute. So if you're interested to see what's going on here with food and with eating, and please come and have some drinks and snacks over there, and I hope you will have a great night. Thank you.